Have you ever stopped to think about why entire populations sometimes end up obeying orders that only a few years earlier they would have considered absolutely unthinkable and morally impossible to accept? How is it that millions of completely ordinary people suddenly begin to follow a single voice, a single narrative, and a single authority figure without seriously questioning what they are being told or asked to do? History has shown this pattern repeating itself again and again across different eras and continents, different countries, different cultures, different leaders. But when you analyze the underlying structure carefully, the method that produces this kind of mass obedience is almost always the same. Because dictators do not rely on brute force alone to maintain power. Force is expensive, force creates resistance, and force eventually produces rebellion. Real power comes from something far more efficient and far more sustainable: control of the human mind. And once you understand the psychological system behind blind obedience, you begin to notice that many of these same techniques appear in many other areas of life: in politics, in propaganda, in media narratives, and sometimes even in everyday influence. So the real question is not simply how dictators gain power in the first place. The deeper question is how they manage to create a system where millions of people eventually defend that power themselves. Let's start with the first and most important step in the entire process. Create fear. Not ordinary fear, but existential fear that makes people feel that their safety, their stability, and their future are all suddenly under threat. Dictators understand something extremely simple yet extremely powerful about human psychology. When people feel safe and stable, they question authority, they debate ideas, and they challenge power structures. But when people feel deeply threatened, they instinctively begin looking for protection and leadership. And whoever appears to provide that protection suddenly becomes powerful almost overnight. If you look closely at almost every authoritarian regime throughout history, you will notice that the rise of centralized control almost always begins during or immediately after a crisis. Economic collapse, war, terrorism, social instability. Sometimes the crisis is completely real. Sometimes it is heavily exaggerated, and sometimes it is even partially manufactured. But the psychological effect produced in the population is always the same. Fear makes people accept things they would normally reject. Mass surveillance, censorship, centralized authority. Because when fear enters the room, freedom tends to quietly leave through the back door. But fear alone is not enough to build a stable system of control. Because fear creates chaos, and chaos must be organized and directed. This is where the second step begins. Create an enemy, a clear and visible target that people can blame for their problems and frustrations. Human beings naturally dislike uncertainty and complexity. They prefer simple explanations for complicated problems, and dictators understand this tendency perfectly, so they identify a specific group. Sometimes it is an external enemy. Sometimes it is a minority within the country. Sometimes it is an ideological opponent, and they present that group as the primary cause of society's suffering. Economic problems? Blame them. Crime? Blame them. Moral decline? Blame them. This tactic becomes incredibly powerful because it redirects public frustration away from the system itself. Instead of people questioning the government or the structure of power, they unite emotionally against a common enemy. Suddenly, criticism disappears, doubt disappears, and extremely complex problems are reduced to simple emotional narratives. Once people believe there is an enemy hiding among them, they begin asking the government for more control, more protection, and more authority. But the system does not stop there. The third step is even more subtle and far more effective in the long run. Control information, not necessarily by banning everything that contradicts the official narrative. That approach is too obvious and often produces resistance. Modern systems of influence usually operate in a more sophisticated way. Instead of eliminating information entirely, authoritarian systems flood the environment with carefully designed narratives, propaganda, selective truths, emotionally charged storytelling, and constant repetition. Because the human brain has a weakness that psychological research has repeatedly demonstrated. The more often we hear something, the more true it begins to feel. Psychologists refer to this phenomenon as the illusory truth effect. If you say something enough times, through enough channels, and through enough different voices, eventually it stops sounding like propaganda. It begins to sound like reality. The message appears in news, in education, in entertainment, in speeches, in posters, in films, in social media. And slowly, people begin to stop questioning it. Because when everyone around you appears to believe something, doubting it starts to feel socially risky, which naturally leads to the fourth step: normalize obedience. This stage is particularly fascinating when you analyze it carefully. Dictators rarely demand total obedience immediately after gaining power. Instead, they build obedience gradually and strategically. Small rules appear first. Minor restrictions follow. Tiny compromises are introduced one by one. Each step feels reasonable when viewed in isolation. Each change seems temporary. Each restriction is justified in the name of safety, stability, or national unity. But over time, those small steps accumulate, and what began as minor adjustments eventually grows into a massive system of control. By the time people begin to realize what has happened, obedience already feels like a normal and expected part of daily life. Psychologists often refer to this process as the footing the door technique. If someone agrees to a small request at the beginning, they become far more likely to agree to a larger request later. Authoritarian systems apply this principle with remarkable precision. But here is where the process becomes even more powerful. Create social pressure. Human beings are deeply tribal creatures. We are biologically wired to conform to the beliefs and behaviors of the group around us. In fact, psychological experiments have shown that people will sometimes deny their own senses if the entire group around them disagrees with what they see. Now imagine that same effect applied across an entire society. When propaganda appears everywhere, when dissent is punished or ridiculed, when loyal citizens are publicly praised and celebrated, a powerful message begins to form. Loyalty becomes social currency. Questioning authority becomes a social risk. Gradually, people begin policing each other's behavior. Neighbors report neighbors. Friends correct friends. Families argue with each other. At that point, the system no longer needs to rely on constant force, because society begins enforcing obedience on its own. But authoritarian leaders rarely stop there. They introduce another powerful psychological tool: the cult of personality. This is the fifth step in the system. Transform the leader into a powerful national symbol. Not just a politician, not just a ruler, but a protector, a savior, a father figure who embodies the identity of the entire nation. This psychological strategy is extremely effective because if the leader becomes the symbol of the country itself, criticizing the leader begins to feel like betraying the nation. Suddenly loyalty becomes emotional, patriotic, moral, And once people attach their personal identity to authority, they begin defending it with remarkable intensity, even when it harms them, even when clear evidence contradicts it, because changing their mind would feel like losing part of their own identity. And human beings instinctively resist threats to their own identity, which brings us to another extremely effective tactic: reward loyalty. Punish doubt, not always through violence or imprisonment, sometimes through something much simpler and far more socially powerful: opportunities, jobs, status, recognition. In many authoritarian systems, loyalty becomes the fastest path to success. The most loyal voices receive promotions. The most enthusiastic supporters receive visibility and influence. Gradually, defending the system becomes personally profitable. Meanwhile, critics experience the opposite outcome: lost opportunities, social isolation, career, public attacks. Eventually, the message becomes unmistakably clear: support the system and your life becomes easier. Question the system and the cost becomes very high. When enough people quietly make that calculation, silence begins spreading throughout society. But the system includes one more subtle strategy. Blind obedience does not always require genuine belief. Sometimes it only requires exhaustion, information overload, endless debates, constant conflict, confusing narratives that contradict each other. When people become mentally exhausted by trying to understand what is true, they often stop searching for clarity. Instead, they begin accepting the dominant story simply because resisting it feels too difficult. This is one of the most underestimated tools of control. Psychological fatigue. A tired population becomes an obedient population. And when people become tired enough, they stop resisting and begin adapting, which leads to the final step: rewrite reality. Over time, authoritarian systems gradually reshape collective memory. History books change. National heroes change. Former villains are replaced by new ones. Events are reinterpreted. Facts are rewritten. The past slowly transforms into a narrative that supports the current power structure. New generations grow up learning that version of reality. For them, the system appears normal, natural, even inevitable. And this is how blind obedience eventually becomes deeply rooted inside a society. Not through one dramatic moment, but through years of careful psychological engineering, step by step. Fear, enemies, propaganda, gradual control, social pressure, identity manipulation, rewards and punishments, mental exhaustion, historical rewriting. Each step alone may appear relatively small, but together they create one of the most powerful systems of influence that humanity has ever seen. And this leads to a crucial question. If these methods are so effective, why do people eventually resist authoritarian systems? The answer lies in something that dictators can never completely control: human awareness. The moment people begin recognizing the system that surrounds them, the illusion slowly begins to crack. Questions begin spreading. Conversations begin happening, and obedience gradually weakens. History has demonstrated this pattern repeatedly. Authoritarian systems often appear invincible for many years, until suddenly they are not, because control built purely on fear can be powerful, but control built on belief is fragile. And once belief begins disappearing, the entire structure can collapse faster than anyone expects. So the real power does not simply lie in understanding dictators. The real power lies in understanding the psychology of influence itself, because these techniques do not exist only in extreme regimes. They also appear in marketing, in politics, in media narratives, in social movements, and in many other areas where human behavior is shaped, which means the most powerful defense against manipulation is awareness. The moment you recognize psychological influence happening around you, it becomes much harder for it to control your decisions. And that single moment of awareness is the one thing every authoritarian system fears the most, because a mind that becomes aware is extremely difficult to dominate. And once enough people become aware at the same time, blind obedience stops being possible.